Some ancient structures don't feel like ruins. They feel like they're still doing their job. Across mountains, deserts, and cities that came much later, stone was shaped with a precision that doesn't match the tools we're told existed at the time. Foundations were laid on unstable ground and never failed. Caves were carved into solid rock and still control water, sound, and space centuries later. These places weren't built to be admired. Tonight, we're looking at real sites, not myths, that quietly challenge what we think we know about ancient engineering and planning. When you see them together, one question becomes impossible to ignore. How did they know this much so early? So settle in, slow down, and let the story unfold. Because some of these structures may change the way you see the past. Songo Manara. Off the southern coast of Tanzania, where the Indian Ocean breathes steadily against mangrove-lined shores and coral reefs lie just beneath the surface, there is a ruined stone town that does not announce itself through height, fortification, or spectacle, but through a careful arrangement of space that only becomes legible when you stop thinking in terms of buildings and begin thinking in terms of ground. This is Songo Manara. Unlike many ancient cities that grew gradually over centuries, Songo Manara appears to have been planned and constructed within a relatively short span of time, flourishing during the 14th and 15th centuries as part of the Swahili world, a network of coastal settlements bound together by trade, language, and the sea. Its streets, houses, mosques, and tombs were not placed randomly. They were set within a deliberate framework of outer platforms that defined how the town was entered, experienced, and remembered. These outer platforms are easy to miss. They do not rise dramatically. They sit low, broad, and quiet, constructed from coral stone and compacted earth, forming raised surfaces that extend beyond individual buildings and blur the boundary between architecture and landscape. But they are essential. The island on which Songo Manara sits is flat, tidal, and vulnerable to seasonal flooding. Building directly on raw ground would have been unstable, unsanitary, and short-lived. The solution was not walls or embankments, but elevation, subtle, distributed, and collective. The outer platforms lifted the town just enough above the natural surface to manage water, define circulation, and establish zones of activity without enclosing them. Rainwater could drain away. Tidal moisture could be resisted. Daily movement could occur without mud, stagnation, or erosion disrupting life. Stone here was used not to dominate the environment, but to negotiate with it. The platforms also structured social space. They created thresholds without gates, boundaries without walls. As you moved inward from the shoreline, the ground itself changed beneath your feet, signaling transition long before any doorway or facade appeared. This is spatial intelligence. Public areas, open courtyards, and gathering spaces were often set upon these raised platforms, making them visible, accessible, and central without isolating them. The town's mosques and tombs, though modest in height, gained presence through placement rather than mass. Elevation created meaning. What makes the outer platforms of Songo Manara particularly striking is their consistency. They follow shared construction principles across the site, suggesting coordinated planning rather than individual household decisions. This was not a town that grew organically through chance. It was composed. The coral stone used to build these platforms was quarried locally, shaped with simple tools, and stacked carefully to create stable bases that resisted erosion from wind and water. Coral is lightweight compared to granite or basalt, but it is brittle. Using it effectively requires understanding load, pressure, and distribution. The builders understood this well. Rather than relying on vertical mass, they spread weight horizontally, creating wide platforms that absorbed stress and allowed buildings above to remain intact even as materials weathered and were replaced over time. This approach reveals a sophisticated understanding of maintenance. Songo Manara was not built to remain unchanged. It was built to be repaired, adapted, and renewed, with the platforms serving as the constant layer beneath shifting human activity. Houses could be rebuilt, walls could crumble, roofs could rot. The platforms endured. The outer platforms also shaped movement through the town. Streets were not rigid corridors, but gently guided paths that followed the logic of raised ground. You moved where the land allowed you to move, where stone had already made passage reliable. This made the town legible without signage or force. People knew where to walk because the ground itself instructed them. In a broader Swahili context, this method of town planning reflects a worldview oriented toward balance rather than domination. Coastal life depended on trade, tides, and seasonal winds. Stability came from adaptation, not control. The outer platforms of Songo Manara embody this philosophy in stone. They do not resist the sea. They anticipate it. They do not fence off land. They prepare it. What is especially revealing is that Songo Manara was eventually abandoned, likely due to shifts in trade routes and political power, not because its infrastructure failed. The platforms continued to function long after people left. They did not collapse. They did not wash away. They simply waited. Walking among the ruins today, the buildings feel fragmented, but the ground feels coherent. The platforms still define space. You can still sense where activity once gathered, where movement slowed, where entry mattered. This inversion is important. The architecture that mattered most at Songo Manara was not vertical, it was foundational. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, the outer platforms of Songo Manara remind us that some of the most advanced urban planning in the pre-modern world occurred in places often overlooked by grand historical narratives. Here, on a small island off the East African coast, builders understood that the success of a town depended less on monuments and more on how people moved, gathered, and stayed dry. Stone served those needs quietly. The platforms do not tell us who ruled Songo Manara. They do not proclaim ideology or conquest. They tell us something far more practical and far more human, that life here was organized carefully, thoughtfully, and with an awareness of time, water, and community. When the town fell silent, the platforms remained, still, holding shape, still defining space, still doing the work they were designed to do, supporting memory without demanding attention. Stone laid low, ground made reliable, a city lifted just enough to endure. That is the legacy of the outer platforms of Songo Manara, a reminder that ancient intelligence often reveals itself not in what rises highest, but in what holds everything else together, quietly beneath our feet. Sirmium. Beneath the modern town of Sremska Mitrovica, where streets, houses, and everyday movement cover the land without pause, there exists another city layered below, not hidden by intention, but buried by time, repetition, and continuity. This is Sirmium. Unlike sites abandoned suddenly or destroyed violently, Sirmium was lived on continuously for centuries. Each generation rebuilt, repaired, expanded, and reused the same ground, and in doing so created a city composed not of a single level, but of stone sublevels, stacked one upon another like pages in a book that was never closed. Sirmium was one of the most important cities of the Roman Empire, an imperial capital positioned along the Sava River, strategically placed between east and west, and powerful enough to produce emperors rather than merely host them. But its true architectural intelligence is not found in statues or surviving walls. It is found beneath the surface. Archaeological excavations revealed that much of Roman Sirmium rested on carefully prepared stone foundations and substructures, laid down to stabilize buildings in a flood-prone river plain where soil alone could not support monumental architecture for long. These stone sublevels were not uniform slabs, but layered systems, stone courses, compacted fill, and drainage elements working together to control moisture and movement. This was not optional engineering. It was survival planning. The river that gave Sirmium life also threatened it. Seasonal flooding could undermine walls, rot foundations, and destabilize entire neighborhoods. The solution was not to fight the river directly, but to discipline the ground beneath the city, allowing water to pass, drain, and disperse without destroying what stood above. Stone became mediator. Public buildings, imperial residences, baths, and administrative complexes were anchored on deep sublevels that distributed weight evenly and resisted subsidence. These foundations were strong, enough that later generations often reused them, building new structures directly on top of old ones, trusting stone laid centuries earlier to carry new loads. This trust matters. It means the builders understood the longevity of their work, and more importantly, they understood where effort mattered most. Ornament could be replaced, walls could be rebuilt, but the sublevels had to endure. Over time, the city rose vertically not through ambition, but through accumulation. Floors were raised, streets were repaved, new buildings replaced old ones, while the stone substructures beneath remained largely intact, slowly disappearing from memory, but never from function. This process created a city in layers. Walking through Sirmium today, one can stand at street level while Roman walls, mosaics, and foundations lie several meters below, perfectly preserved because they were never exposed. The ground itself became archive. This is urban archaeology at its most revealing. The stone. Sublevels also supported complex infrastructure, hypocaust heating systems, water channels, drainage corridors, all of which depended on precise control of elevation and airflow. Baths could not function without stable foundations. Heated floors could not survive without carefully planned voids beneath them. Everything depended on what lay below. Sirmium sublevels reflect a broader Roman understanding that cities are systems, not collections of buildings. Streets, water, waste, heat, and movement had to work together. Stone foundations provided the constant that allowed these systems to evolve without collapse. This kind of planning is easy to overlook because it is invisible when it succeeds. No monument announces good foundations. No inscription celebrates proper drainage. And yet, without these sublevels, Sirmium would never have achieved its imperial status. What makes Sirmium especially relevant in a series exploring structures that challenge modern expectations is how quietly advanced it is. There is no mystery technology here. No speculation is required. The intelligence lies in restraint and foresight, in doing the unglamorous work first and trusting that it would carry everything else. Stone here was not a symbol. It was insurance. Even after the Roman Empire declined, the city continued to be occupied. Medieval structures reused Roman foundations. Modern buildings still sit above them. The sublevels continue to do their work long after the civilization that designed them disappeared. That continuity is extraordinary. It reminds us that some of the most successful ancient engineering was never meant to be admired directly. It was meant to be relied upon, generation after generation, without question. Standing in excavated sections of Sirmium today, the experience is humbling. You are not looking at ruins that failed. You are looking at systems that succeeded so well they became invisible, walls that did not fall, floors that did not sink, cities that endured by knowing where to place stone. In a world fascinated by towering monuments and dramatic collapse, Sirmium offers a different lesson, that history is often carried by what remains unseen, by foundations trusted enough to be forgotten. The stone sublevels of Sirmium do not argue with history. They support it, quietly, continuously, and without interruption. And that may be their greatest achievement, pre-neuralgic platforms of Sardinia. Long before the iconic stone towers of Sardinia began to rise across the island's hills, before the Nurag came to define the landscape and the culture that built them, there was an earlier, quieter phase of stonework that laid the intellectual and architectural groundwork for everything that followed. These are the pre-neuralgic platforms of Sardinia. They do not announce themselves dramatically. There are no towering silhouettes visible from miles away, no vertical statements of dominance or defense. Instead, these platforms sit low against the land, broad, leveled stone surfaces carefully constructed on slopes, ridges, and elevated ground, often blending so seamlessly into the terrain that they are easy to overlook. And that subtlety is exactly what makes them important. The pre-neuralgic period, spanning roughly the late Neolithic to early Bronze Age, represents a time when Sardinian communities were still experimenting with permanence, social organization, and how stone could shape space rather than simply mark it. These platforms were not buildings in the conventional sense. They were prepared grounds, foundations without superstructures that survive, suggesting that what mattered most was not what stood above, but what was stabilized below. Stone here was used to discipline the landscape. The platforms were constructed by leveling uneven bedrock, reinforcing edges with large stone blocks, and filling voids with compacted material to create stable horizontal surfaces. This kind of work requires patience and planning. It produces no immediate visual reward, but it transforms how a place can be used. Once ground is made level and reliable, everything changes. Activities that require gathering become possible. Ritual movement becomes predictable. Structures made of perishable materials can be rebuilt repeatedly on the same base. The pre-Nuragic platforms appear across Sardinia in varied forms: circular, oval, and irregular, often associated with megalithic tombs, standing stones, or early enclosures. Their locations are rarely accidental. They occupy commanding but not defensive positions, overlooking valleys, coastlines, or natural routes of movement. Visibility mattered. Control did not. This suggests that these platforms were not military or administrative. They were social anchors, places where communities returned, recognized, and remembered. The stone fixed the location, even as everything built upon it could change or disappear. What makes these platforms especially significant is how clearly they anticipate later Nuragic architecture. The logic is the same: stabilize first, rise later. Nuraghe towers do not emerge from untouched ground. They rely on prepared foundations, knowledge of load distribution, and an understanding of how stone behaves over time. The pre-Nuragic builders learned these lessons early. They experimented with mass without height, with permanence without display, with planning without hierarchy. There is no evidence of centralized authority during this period, no palaces, no elite compounds. The platforms appear to have been constructed through collective effort, repeated across generations, each community reinforcing the same architectural logic rather than competing for visual dominance. This repetition matters more than scale. It shows that knowledge was shared, that techniques were trusted, that stone was already understood as something more than raw material. The platforms also reveal a sophisticated response to Sardinia's geology. The island's bedrock varies dramatically from region to region, and the builders adapted accordingly, selecting stone types that resisted weathering, arranging blocks to accommodate natural fractures, and allowing slight flexibility in construction rather than forcing rigid geometry onto uneven ground. This is adaptive engineering, not imposing form, but negotiating with material. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, the pre-Nuragic platforms of Sardinia remind us that architectural intelligence does not begin with monuments. It begins with preparation, with understanding where effort will last the longest. These platforms did not need to survive visibly to succeed. They succeeded by allowing life, ritual, and construction to recur in the same place over centuries. Standing on one of these platforms today, the experience is understated. There is no spectacle. The ground simply feels right. Level, stable, intentional. You sense that this was a place meant to hold people, not impress them. And that may be the clearest sign of its purpose. The later Nuragic civilization did not appear suddenly or mysteriously. It rose from a foundation of quiet decisions made long before towers were imagined. Decisions about where to build, how to stabilize, and how to let stone carry memory across generations. The pre-Nuragic platforms are those decisions made visible, low to the ground, patient, unassuming. They are the moment when Sardinian societies learned that stone did not need to rise to matter, it only needed to remain. And by remaining, these platforms shaped everything that came after, proving that the most important architecture is often the kind that history almost forgets to look for. Not because it failed, but because it worked exactly as intended. Tel Caramel, on a low rise in northern Syria, overlooking land that has witnessed the very first experiments in settled human life. There is a site that quietly unsettles one of archaeology's most comfortable assumptions, that monumental stone architecture only appears after farming, hierarchy, and complex societies are already firmly in place. This is Tel Caramel. At first glance, the mound appears modest, almost forgettable, especially when compared to later cities and temples that dominate textbooks. There are no towering walls, no dramatic silhouettes against the sky. But beneath this restraint lies something far more disruptive to our understanding of early human behavior. Here, more than 11,000 years ago, people built stone towers. Not one tower, not by accident, but again and again. Excavations at Tel Caramel have revealed a sequence of circular stone towers constructed during the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a time when humans were only beginning to experiment with permanent settlement, long before ceramics, metallurgy, or formal states. These towers were not crude piles of rock. They were carefully planned structures with curved stone walls, controlled entrances, and deliberate placement within the settlement. This alone changes the timeline. The earliest tower at Tel Caramel predates the famous Tower of Jericho, which for decades was considered the world's first monumental structure. Tel Caramel quietly takes that title, and with it forces a reconsideration of why humans began building in stone at all. The towers are not defensive. Their height, thickness, and location do not support military use. They do not overlook territory or protect resources. Instead, they occupy central positions within the settlement, surrounded by domestic activity rather than separated from it. This central placement matters. Architecture, at the center of daily life, becomes reference rather than barrier. People move around it. They gather near it. They orient themselves by it. Over time, it becomes more than a structure. It becomes memory made visible. The towers were built using carefully selected stones stacked in circular courses, a technique that distributes weight evenly and increases stability without mortar. This choice shows an intuitive understanding of geometry and load-bearing principles at an astonishingly early date. Curves resist collapse. Mass is spread outward. Stone locks itself in place. This is structural intelligence emerging at the very beginning of settled life. What is especially striking is that these towers were rebuilt. When one phase ended, another was constructed nearby or directly above earlier remains, maintaining the same basic form across generations. This repetition tells us that the towers were not temporary solutions. They mattered enough to renew. Rebuilding requires memory. Memory requires meaning. At a time when survival demanded constant attention to food, water, and shelter, these communities invested energy into structures that provided none of those directly. The towers did not store grain. They did not house families. They did not protect against enemies. Their value was social. They were places of gathering, orientation, and shared identity. Architecture that helped transform groups of people into communities anchored to a specific place. This challenges the idea that monumentality emerges only after surplus and hierarchy. At Tel Caramel, monumentality appears first, helping create the cohesion that later made agriculture and long-term settlement possible. Stone did not follow society. Society gathered around stone. The construction of these towers required cooperation. Stones had to be gathered, transported, and placed with care. Courses had to remain even. Curvature had to be maintained. This work could not be done casually or individually. Yet there is no evidence of rulers, elites, or coercive power. What we see instead is collective architecture, shared effort focused on shared meaning. Standing at Tel Caramel today, the towers no longer rise. They survive as foundations, low walls, and circular traces in the soil. But their reduced height does not diminish their importance. If anything, it clarifies it. These towers represent one of the earliest moments when humans decided that stone could outlast memory. That building something permanent was worth the effort, even when permanence was not guaranteed elsewhere in life. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, Tel Caramel occupies a critical position because it does not just question how early humans built. It questions why they began building at all. The towers suggest that humans did not wait for civilization to appear before shaping stone into meaning. They shaped stone to help civilization begin. Stone became anchor. Anchor became gathering. Gathering became continuity. That sequence matters. Tel Caramel does. Tel, not offer dramatic ruins or towering monuments. It offers something quieter and far more profound. Evidence that the human desire for permanence, shared space, and collective memory emerged far earlier than history once allowed. These stone towers were not expressions of power. They were expressions of belonging. And in that sense, they may represent one of the earliest architectural statements humanity ever made. Not about control of land, but about commitment to place. Stone laid in circles. Circles holding people. People holding time. That is the true legacy of the stone towers of Tel Caramel. Sesklo. On a low hill overlooking the fertile plains of Thessaly, where agriculture would quietly reshape the destiny of Europe, there is a settlement whose importance does not come from walls, towers, or monuments, but from something far more subtle and far more foundational. This is Sesklo. Long before cities rose, long before states or written law, people here made a decision that would change how humans lived forever. They chose to stay. And staying, in a world of seasonal rain, shifting soil, and uneven land, required more than huts and hearths. It required ground that could be trusted. The terrace foundations of Sesklo are among the earliest examples of deliberate landscape engineering in Europe, dating back more than 8,000 years to the early Neolithic period. These were not accidental accumulations of stone. They were planned, reinforced platforms cut into sloping terrain and stabilized with stone retaining walls, creating level surfaces where none naturally existed. This was not construction for display. It was construction for continuity. The builders of Sesklo understood something fundamental. That permanent life depends not on what you place on the land, but on how you prepare the land itself. Uneven ground erodes. Slopes fail. Structures crack and shift. Terraces solve these problems quietly, by redistributing weight and guiding water away from vulnerable areas. Stone here became mediator between nature and intention. The terraces were built by cutting into the hillside, reinforcing edges with stone, and filling the interior with compacted earth and rubble, creating stable, horizontal living surfaces that resisted collapse even during heavy seasonal rains. This process is labor-intensive and slow, offering no immediate reward beyond stability. That patience matters. Sesklo was not occupied briefly. It was lived in for centuries, rebuilt again and again on the same terraced foundations. Houses changed. Materials evolved. But the Eifate ground beneath them remained reliable, trusted enough to carry new generations. This reuse is critical. It tells us that the terraces were understood as permanent infrastructure, something worth maintaining, respecting, and passing on. Knowledge of how to build and repair them was shared, likely through demonstration rather than instruction, embedded in daily practice rather than formal teaching. Stone became memory. The layout of the settlement reveals intentional organization. Terraces are arranged to maximize sunlight, drainage, and accessibility, guiding movement naturally without enclosing it. Pathways follow contours rather than forcing straight lines, allowing the settlement to expand organically while remaining coherent. This is planning without rigidity. There is no evidence of centralized authority imposing order from above. No palaces. No elite compounds. The terraces suggest collective agreement, a shared understanding of how space should function for everyone. This challenges a common narrative. We often imagine early farming communities as simple, reactive, and technically limited. Sesklo contradicts that image completely. These people understood slope management, load distribution, and long-term maintenance at a time when metal tools were unknown and experimentation carried real risk. A failed terrace is not easily repaired, yet Sesklo endured. The choice to invest in stone foundations also reveals a shift in worldview. Nomadic groups move when land becomes unreliable. Settled groups reshape land to remain. Terracing is a declaration of commitment, not just to a place, but to a future lived in that place. This is where architecture becomes identity. Sesklo's terraces also influenced everything that followed. Later, Neolithic settlements across Greece and the Balkans adopt similar techniques, refining them, expanding them, but never abandoning the core principle learned here. Stabilize first, build second. The foundation comes before the form. Standing at Sesklo today, the terraces appear modest, almost understated. Low stone walls, flattened ground, nothing dramatic. And yet, without these foundations, nothing else at the site could have existed. This is architecture at its most honest. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, the terrace foundations of Sesklo are essential because they show that technological intelligence does not begin with monuments. It begins with understanding gravity, water, and time, and making choices that respect all three. The people of Sesklo were not trying to build history. They were trying to live, and in learning how to hold the land steady beneath their feet, they laid one of the earliest architectural foundations of European civilization: stone holding soil, soil holding homes, homes holding generations. That is the quiet achievement of Sesklo. Not a city that rose suddenly into greatness, but a settlement that learned how to remain patiently, intelligently, and with just enough stone placed in exactly the right places to make permanence possible for the first time. And in that act of staying, history truly began. Polyokni. On the island of Lemnos, where the northern Aegean opens toward Anatolia and the sea has always carried more than just ships, there lies a settlement whose true importance is not found in its walls or streets, but in what lies beneath them. This is Polyokni, often described as one of Europe's earliest proto-cities. Polyokni was inhabited continuously for centuries during the early Bronze Age, long before classical Greece, long before monumental temples, and long before the political systems we usually associate with urban life. What allowed that continuity was not scale or spectacle. It was foundation. Beneath the visible remains of houses, courtyards, and streets are lower stone levels, carefully laid substructures that stabilize the settlement in a seismically active, erosion-prone environment where building without preparation would have guaranteed failure. Polyokni was not placed gently on the land. It was anchored to it. The settlement sits on uneven ground near the coast, exposed to wind, water runoff, and earthquakes. Mud brick alone would not survive here for long. The solution was to create stone bases beneath walls, floors, and streets. Low, wide foundations that distributed weight evenly and absorbed movement rather than resisting it. These lower stone levels are subtle. They do not rise high. They do not announce themselves, but they carry everything above them. Archaeological layers at Polyokni reveal multiple phases of rebuilding, each one respecting and reusing earlier stone foundations. Walls were replaced, layouts shifted, materials changed, but the stone levels beneath remained stable enough to be trusted again and again. This trust matters. It tells us that the builders understood not only how to place stone, but how stone behaves over time. They knew which parts of a structure could change, and which could not. The lower levels consist of carefully arranged stones, fitted tightly without mortar, forming continuous bands beneath walls and streets. In some areas, these stone bases also functioned as drainage layers, allowing moisture to pass through without undermining the structures above. This is integrated thinking. Water was not treated as an enemy. It was given a path. The streets of Polyokni, among the earliest paved streets in Europe, rely on these lower stone levels to remain passable. Without them, seasonal rain would have turned movement into mud, isolating parts of the settlement and disrupting daily life. Stone here supported social function. What makes Polyokni especially important is how early this approach appears. At a time when many communities were still experimenting with permanence, Polyokni shows a clear understanding of urban logic, that a city is not just buildings, but systems of movement, support, and repair. The lower stone levels are evidence of foresight. They required extra labor, extra material, and extra time, all invested into parts of the settlement that would never be seen or admired. This kind of decision only makes sense if the builders expected to remain, and expected others to remain after them. This expectation of future use is one of the clearest signs of early urban thinking. Polyochnai was not a temporary aggregation of houses. It was a place designed to endure. The reuse of foundations also suggests shared standards. Different households built differently above ground, but below ground, the logic remained consistent. This implies common knowledge rather than individual experimentation, a shared understanding of how to build correctly in this environment. Stone knowledge here was communal. The lower levels also allowed the settlement to grow denser over time. As population increased, new structures could be added without destabilizing the whole, because the ground beneath had already been disciplined. This density is a hallmark of urban life. Cities begin where ground can be trusted. In a series, exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, the lower stone levels of Polyochnai matter because they demonstrate that advanced planning did not suddenly appear with palaces or temples. It emerged quietly, through repeated decisions to do the unglamorous work first. Prepare the ground, then build. Standing among the ruins today, Polyochnai feels fragmented. Walls rise only slightly above the earth. Layouts must be imagined. But the stone beneath your feet still does its job. The ground feels firm, intentional, held. That sensation is not accidental. It is the result of decisions made thousands of years ago by people who understood that permanence begins below eye level. Polyochnai does not confront history with mystery or spectacle. It corrects it through clarity. It shows that the roots of urban life lie not in sudden innovation, but in patient refinement, in learning how to stabilize land well enough that human life can grow complex upon it. Stone placed, low, support made invisible, a city made possible. That is the quiet achievement of the lower stone levels of Polyochnai, an early lesson in urban intelligence that still holds true wherever people build and expect to stay. Not everything that shapes history rises high. Some of it lies just beneath the surface, doing its work so well that it disappears, until we finally learn where to look. Bubanj Hill. On the southern edge of the modern city of Niš, where traffic moves quickly and contemporary life presses forward without pause, there is a low hill that holds something most people never notice. A record of human continuity so deep that it quietly dissolves the idea that early societies were fragile, temporary, or unsure of how to stay. This is Bubanj Hill. At first glance, the site feels unremarkable. A gentle rise, exposed earth, scattered stone. Nothing that announces monumentality or power. And yet, Bubanj is one of the longest continuously used prehistoric sites in southeastern Europe, occupied repeatedly from the Neolithic period through the Bronze Age and beyond. What allowed that continuity was not chance, it was preparation. Beneath the visible remains are stone terraces and reinforced ground levels that transformed a naturally unstable slope into a place that could be returned to, rebuilt upon, and trusted across generations. Bubanj is not defined by a single structure or phase. It is defined by how carefully the land itself was shaped to endure use. The hill's natural slope presents a problem. Rainwater accelerates downhill, eroding soil and destabilizing anything built directly on top. Early builders recognized this immediately. Rather than abandoning the location, they reshaped it. Stone terraces were cut into the hillside, reinforced with retaining walls built from locally gathered stone, creating horizontal living surfaces where none existed naturally. These terraces slowed water, trapped soil, and redistributed weight, preventing collapse during heavy seasonal rains. This is landscape engineering, and it appears here astonishingly early. The terraces at Bubanj were not built once and forgotten. Archaeological layers show repeated rebuilding, repair, and reuse. Houses came and went. Hearths shifted. Materials changed. But the terraces remained, maintained, respected, and trusted. That trust is everything. It tells us that the builders understood which parts of their work mattered most. Walls could be replaced. Roofs could rot. But the ground beneath had to be stable, or nothing else would last. This logic reflects long-term thinking. The stone retaining walls themselves are modest in height, but disciplined in construction. Larger stones anchor the base. Smaller stones lock gaps and distribute pressure. No mortar is used, allowing slight movement without catastrophic failure, a critical adaptation in a region affected by freeze-thaw cycles and seismic activity. Flexibility was built into the system. The terraces also structured daily life. Movement up and down the hill followed predictable paths, shaped by elevation changes. Social space emerged organically along the stepped surfaces. The landscape itself guided behavior without walls or enforcement. Architecture here did not impose order, it revealed it. What makes Bubanj particularly important is how early this approach appears. In the Neolithic layers, we already see deliberate slope management at a time when many models still describe societies as small, mobile, and lightly invested in place. Bubanj contradicts that entirely. These people were not passing through, they were staying, and they expected others to stay after them. Terracing is a declaration of commitment. It is labor-intensive, slow, and meaningless if a site is abandoned quickly. To build terraces is to believe in a future lived in the same place. That belief shaped Bubanj. Over centuries, the hill accumulated memory. Each generation encountered a landscape already altered by those before them. Instead of erasing it, they worked within it, reinforcing the same terraces, adjusting them slightly, but never abandoning the core logic. This continuity suggests shared knowledge passed down not through writing, but through practice. Children watching adults repair walls, rebuild surfaces, and respond to seasonal change. Stone knowledge became cultural memory. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, Bubanj Hill matters because it shows that advanced planning did not begin with cities, rulers, or monuments. It began with understanding gravity, water, and time, and choosing to shape land accordingly. There is no spectacle here, and that is the point. The terraces were never meant to impress outsiders. They were meant to work, quietly, reliably, and repeatedly. Their success is measured by how long the site remained usable, not by how dramatic it looked. Standing on Bubanj Hill today, surrounded by modern development, the contrast is striking. The city has changed countless times. Materials, technologies, and priorities have shifted rapidly, but the ancient terraces still hold the slope. They still manage water. They still define space. They still do the job they were designed to do. That endurance is not accidental. Bubanj Hill reminds us that some of the most important prehistoric achievements are not visible as monuments. They exist as decisions embedded into the land. Decisions about where to place stone, where to let water move, and how to make a place worth returning to. Stone holding soil, soil holding homes, homes holding generations. That is the quiet legacy of Bubanj Hill, a site that teaches us that permanence was not discovered suddenly, but built patiently, one terrace at a time, long before history decided to start keeping records. And once you notice that, the hill no longer feels ordinary at all. Cuelap, high in the cloud forests of northern Peru, where mist moves slowly through mountain ridges and visibility shifts from clear to obscured within minutes, there is a stone complex so massive, so deliberately placed, that it feels less like a settlement and more like a decision carved permanently into the landscape. This is Cuelap. It does not sit on a mountain, it becomes the mountain. Perched atop a narrow limestone ridge more than 3,000 meters above sea level, Cuelap stretches for nearly 600 meters, enclosed by stone walls that rise up to 20 meters high in places, built not to be seen from afar, but to hold, support, and stabilize an entire community against gravity, weather, and time. From below, the walls appear almost impossible. They rise sheer from the slope, offering no gradual transition between land and structure. There is no attempt to soften the boundary. Stone meets air abruptly, creating the impression that the ridge itself has been cut and reshaped into architecture. This was not opportunistic building. It was landscape transformation. Cuelap was constructed by the Chachapoya culture centuries before the expansion of the Inca, in a region defined by steep terrain, heavy rainfall, and constant erosion. Building here required more than stacking stone. It required understanding how water moves, how slopes fail, and how weight must be distributed to prevent collapse. The solution was radical. Rather than carving down into the ridge, the builders built upward, filling the interior of the enclosure with massive amounts of stone and earth, creating an artificial plateau capable of supporting hundreds of circular stone dwellings, ceremonial spaces, and pathways. The walls are not hollow. They are retaining structures on an extraordinary scale. Most of Kuelap's mass exists not in what you see from the outside, but in what lies behind the walls. Millions of tons of fill carefully packed to create level ground, on a naturally narrow and unstable ridge. This is engineering disguised as monument. Access to Kuelap is tightly controlled. Only 3 entrances pierce the walls, each narrowing sharply as it passes inward, forcing anyone entering to move in single file. These corridors are not decorative. They are deliberate bottlenecks, shaped to slow movement, restrict numbers, and give defenders advantage without the need for towers or weapons. Architecture here does the work of defense. But Kuelap is not simply a fortress. Inside the walls, the layout tells a different story. Hundreds of circular houses once filled the plateau, arranged in clusters rather than rigid grids. Movement between them is fluid. There are no straight streets imposing order. Instead, paths follow gentle curves, adapting to the terrain beneath. This balance matters. Kuelap combines control at the boundary with flexibility inside, a clear distinction between protection and daily life. The builders understood where rigidity was necessary and where adaptability mattered more. Drainage is one of Kuelap's most revealing features. The cloud forest receives heavy rainfall, and without careful planning, the entire structure would have collapsed under waterlogged fill. To prevent this, the builders integrated hundreds of drainage channels into the walls and interior surfaces, allowing rainwater to escape gradually without eroding the core. This system still works. Water enters, water exits. Stone remains stable. That continuity tells us something critical. This was not experimental construction. It was the result of accumulated knowledge, refined through experience in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. Kuelap was not built quickly. It grew. Construction likely spanned generations, each one adding to the mass, reinforcing walls, expanding interior space, and maintaining the systems that allowed the site to survive. This slow accumulation is visible in subtle variations in stonework and layout, suggesting adaptation rather than rigid master planning. And yet, coherence remains. The site feels intentional from end to end. What makes Kuelap especially important in a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations is not its scale alone, but its logic. The builders did not attempt to dominate the environment through height or ornamentation. They worked with gravity, water, and terrain, shaping stone into stability rather than spectacle. This is not imperial architecture. It is resilient architecture. When the Inca later encountered the Chachapoya, Kuelap was already ancient. Its builders eventually abandoned the site, likely due to social and political shifts rather than structural failure. The walls did not collapse. The drainage did not fail. The mountains simply fell silent. Walking through Kuelap today is a slow experience. Mist rolls in. Sound is muted. The walls feel close, not overwhelming, but enclosing. You become aware of edges, drops, and weight beneath your feet. You are standing on engineering. Every step rests on decisions made long before you arrived. Decisions about where to place stone, how much to fill, how to let water move, and how to shape space so that people could live safely on a knife-edge ridge. In a world that often associates ancient intelligence with flat plains and river valleys, Kuelap offers a correction. It shows that advanced planning also emerged in extreme environments, where mistakes were unforgiving and success demanded patience rather than power. The builders of Kuelap did not leave written records. They left something more durable: stone holding earth, earth holding homes, homes holding community. That is the real achievement of Kuelap. Not that it rises high above the forest, but that it made an impossible place livable, and then held that possibility steady for centuries. Even now, as vegetation slowly reclaims the walls, and mist softens every outline, the structure does not feel like a ruin. It feels like a paused decision. A reminder that long before modern engineering, people understood how to reshape entire landscapes, not to conquer them, but to remain. And in doing so, they left behind one of the most quietly astonishing stone constructions in the ancient world, My Son Sanctuary. In a narrow valley surrounded by low, forested mountains in central Vietnam, there is a sacred landscape where stone does not dominate through mass alone, but through repetition, precision, and an understanding of material that feels quietly advanced, even by modern standards. This is My Son Sanctuary. At first, the site appears modest. Clusters of ruined towers, broken walls, scattered fragments of brick and stone. There are no vast enclosures, no colossal platforms, no overwhelming sense of scale. And yet, the longer you remain here, the clearer it becomes that this place was not built for spectacle. It was built for continuity. My son served as the spiritual heart of the Champa civilization for over 1,000 years, from roughly the 4th century to the 13th century CE. Generation after generation returned to this same valley to build, rebuild, repair, and expand their sanctuaries, each phase respecting the logic of what came before. This was not replacement architecture. It was layered devotion. The temples of My Son are constructed primarily from brick, not stone, and this choice is central to why the site is still debated today. The bricks are small, uniform, and fitted together so precisely that the joints between them are nearly invisible. In many places, it is impossible to insert even a thin blade between courses. No mortar is visible. This absence has puzzled researchers for decades. The bricks appear bonded as if fused, their surfaces smoothed and shaped after placement rather than before. The technique suggests that the builders understood brick as a system, not as individual units, a material whose behavior could be controlled through heat, pressure, and placement. Stone appears selectively. Sandstone is used for door frames, foundations, and sculptural elements, the parts of the structure that endure the greatest stress. Brick carries the walls upward. Stone anchors them to the ground. This division of labor between materials is deliberate. The temples follow a consistent architectural grammar. A central sanctuary tower rises on a raised base, oriented carefully, often toward the east, while auxiliary structures surround it, forming a ceremonial ensemble rather than a single isolated building. You do not approach randomly. You are guided by alignment, elevation, and threshold. The foundations beneath these temples are just as important as what rises above them. Stone bases stabilize the brick superstructures, distributing weight and resisting settlement in a valley subject to seasonal rain, humidity, and ground movement. Without these foundations, the towers would have cracked and failed within decades. Instead, many endured for centuries. What makes My Son especially compelling in a series about ancient structures that challenge modern expectations is not mystery alone, but consistency. The same principles are applied again and again across time. Careful foundations, precise brickwork, controlled proportions, and respect for alignment. This suggests institutional knowledge. Not individual genius, but shared technique passed from builder to builder, generation to generation, without written manuals or standardized measurements as we understand them today. The valley itself was chosen deliberately. Mountains shield it from strong coastal winds. The ground slopes gently, allowing water to drain away from temple bases. The surrounding landscape creates natural enclosure without walls. Nature participates in the design. Ritual activity here was tied not only to buildings, but to space. The movement between towers, the approach along paths, the relationship between sound, echo, and enclosure. Chanting within the valley carries differently. The mountains reflect and soften sound, creating an acoustic environment suited to ceremony rather than proclamation. This was not a place of crowds. It was a place of return. Temples were rebuilt on older foundations, sometimes directly atop earlier sanctuaries, preserving orientation even as materials changed. This respect for placement suggests that the exact location mattered as much as the structure itself. Sacred ground was fixed. Even when buildings collapsed or were damaged by time, conflict, or weather, new ones rose where the old had stood, maintaining continuity across centuries of change. The builders of my son did not aim for permanence through mass. They aimed for permanence through renewal. Brick can be repaired. Stone can be replaced. Meaning persists through repetition. This philosophy stands in contrast to cultures that sought eternity through immovable monuments. Here, eternity was achieved through care, return, and maintenance. Walking through my son today, the atmosphere is subdued. The jungle presses close. Light filters unevenly through trees and ruined walls. Nothing feels finished, yet nothing feels accidental. The site feels paused rather than abandoned. In a broader sense, my son challenges the assumption that advanced architecture must rely on heavy stone or dramatic scale. It shows that precision, material understanding, and long-term planning can be expressed through restraint rather than dominance. The Champa builders understood that stability comes from balance, between materials, between ground and structure, between ritual and repair. Brick shaped carefully. Stone placed where it mattered. Foundations trusted to carry meaning forward. That is the lesson embedded here. My son does not confront history loudly. It invites attention quietly. It asks us to notice how much knowledge can exist without leaving behind a single written explanation. The techniques are still debated. The rituals are partially forgotten. The people are gone. But the logic remains. In a series exploring ancient structures that appear beyond modern expectations, my son stands as evidence that technological sophistication does not always announce itself through scale or mystery. Sometimes it reveals itself through patience, through cultures that return to the same ground, used the same principles, and trusted that continuity itself was a form of intelligence. Stone and brick, working together. Foundations holding faith. A valley shaped into memory. That is what the My Son Sanctuary truly represents. Not a lost technology, but a sustained understanding of how to build in harmony with land, climate, and time. And that understanding, quietly embedded in brick and stone, is what still holds this place together today. Timgad. On the northern edge of the Sahara, where the land begins to dry and the mountains of the Are rise quietly in the distance, there is a city laid out with such confidence and precision that it feels less like a ruin and more like an idea preserved in stone. This is Timgad. Unlike many ancient settlements that evolved slowly, adapting to terrain and circumstance, Timgad appears almost suddenly in history, founded around the year 100 CE under the Roman Emperor Trajan, not as a village that grew into a city, but as a city planned in full before the first stone was placed. From above, its logic is unmistakable. A perfect grid. Straight streets intersect at right angles. The main axes, the Cardo and the Decumanus, cross at the city's center, dividing space into orderly blocks. Nothing here is accidental. Nothing curves to follow the land. Instead, the land is corrected, disciplined, and made to obey geometry. This is not organic urbanism. It is intentional order. But what makes Timgad extraordinary is not the grid itself. Roman cities followed grids elsewhere. What makes Timgad unsettling is how completely that plan was executed and how well it endured. Stone foundations were laid with precision across uneven ground, creating level streets and stable platforms in a region where temperature extremes, seasonal rain, and soil movement would normally break down poorly prepared construction. The builders did not adapt the city to the land. They re-engineered the land to support the city. Beneath the visible streets and buildings lie carefully prepared stone sublevels, compacted layers of stone and rubble designed to distribute weight, manage water runoff, and prevent subsidence. Without these unseen foundations, the grid would have warped, cracked, and failed within generations. Instead, it held. The streets of Timgad are paved with stone slabs, fitted tightly enough that cart ruts are still visible today, frozen into place by centuries of use. Beneath these pavements, drainage channels carry water away from the city core, preventing flooding and erosion during rare but destructive rains. Water here is controlled, not resisted. Public buildings, the forum, basilica, baths, libraries, and temples, rest on reinforced stone platforms that stabilize their mass and isolate them from ground movement. These structures were meant to last, and they were anchored accordingly. This is infrastructure thinking. Timgad was not built to impress a moment. It was built to function for centuries. What is especially striking is how human life was organized by this stone logic. The grid did not just impose order on space. It shaped movement, interaction, and routine. Streets guided daily activity. Public spaces were positioned for accessibility rather than spectacle. The city encouraged participation, not awe. Even leisure was planned. Bath complexes were integrated into the street network. The theater was placed where sound and access could be controlled naturally. Markets opened into wide plazas rather than cramped lanes. Stone here structured society. Timgad's location was strategic but challenging. The nearby desert brought dust, heat, and isolation. Supplying the city required careful planning. Aqueducts delivered water from distant sources, while underground channels distributed it efficiently throughout the urban grid. Again, what matters is not visibility, it is reliability. The city prospered for centuries, weathering political change, invasion, and economic shift. When it was eventually abandoned, it was not because the city failed, but because trade routes and imperial priorities moved elsewhere. The stone did its job. Sand slowly buried the city, preserving it rather than destroying it. When Timgad was rediscovered centuries later, the grid emerged almost intact, streets still readable, foundations still level, logic still clear. This preservation is revealing. It shows that the builders of Timgad understood not only how to construct, but how to anticipate decay. They built with the expectation that time would pass, that maintenance might fail, that conditions would change, and they planned for resilience rather than perfection. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, Timgad stands as a reminder that advanced engineering does not always announce itself through mystery or scale. Sometimes it announces itself through clarity. Everything here makes sense. And that is precisely what feels unsettling. Modern cities often struggle to achieve what Timgad achieved nearly 2,000 years ago. Coherent planning, durable infrastructure, and human-scaled order executed consistently from foundation to street. Standing in Timgad today, the silence is striking. Streets lead somewhere, even though no one walks them. Doorways open into emptiness. The city still expects life. That expectation was built into the stone. Timgad does not challenge history by suggesting lost technology or forgotten machines. It challenges history by showing how much could be achieved through disciplined planning, collective labor, and deep understanding of materials. Stone placed with purpose, ground shaped for endurance, order embedded into landscape. This was not accidental brilliance, it was systemic intelligence. And as the desert slowly reclaims the city, covering walls and uncovering them again with shifting sand, the plan remains legible. A reminder that when humans understand how to build from the ground up, even time has difficulty erasing the result. Timgad stands not as a ruin of ambition, but as evidence of what happens when ambition is restrained by knowledge. A city drawn in stone, a landscape taught to hold order, a human idea made durable. And long after the empire that built it disappeared, the city still waits, perfectly aligned, perfectly silent, and perfectly clear about what ancient people were capable of achieving when they decided not to improvise, but to plan. Ziggurat of Dur Kurigalzu. On the western edge of modern Baghdad, where the plains of Mesopotamia stretch flat and exposed beneath an open sky, a massive stepped structure rises from the earth with a gravity that feels older than memory itself, not because of its height alone, but because of how deliberately it claims the ground beneath it. This is the ziggurat of Dur Kurigalzu. Known today as Akartuf, the site was founded in the 14th century BCE by the Kassite king Kurigalzu I, during a period when Mesopotamia was already layered with cities, temples, and traditions thousands of years old. And yet, This ziggurat does not feel like repetition. It feels like refinement. Unlike later monuments built to impress through ornament or narrative reliefs, the ziggurat of Dur Kurigalzu communicates through mass, alignment, and restraint. It does not rise sharply. It steps upward deliberately, each tier reinforcing the one below, creating a structure that feels anchored rather than elevated. This is not a tower reaching for the sky. It is a platform stabilizing the earth. The core of the ziggurat is constructed from millions of mud bricks, but what gives it endurance is the careful integration of stone and baked brick at critical stress points, particularly at the base and outer facing. These materials were chosen not for decoration, but for resistance to water, wind, and time. Mesopotamia floods. Mud dissolves. Foundations fail, unless they are planned correctly. The builders of Dur Kurigalzu understood this intimately. The ziggurat rests on a massive prepared base, designed to distribute weight evenly across the soft alluvial soil. Without this foundation logic, the structure would have slumped, cracked, and collapsed within generations. Instead, it stands. Even today, despite erosion and partial collapse, the ziggurat remains one of the most imposing ancient structures in Iraq, its silhouette visible from miles away, still defining the horizon, after more than 3,000 years. The orientation of the ziggurat is precise. Its sides align closely with the cardinal directions, reflecting a worldview in which architecture was tied directly to cosmic order. This alignment was not symbolic alone. It helped regulate sunlight exposure, thermal stress, and drainage behavior across the structure's surfaces. Cosmology and engineering worked together. Stairways once ascended the terraces, guiding ritual movement upward in controlled stages. You did not approach the summit quickly. You progressed through elevation, with each level marking transition rather than destination. The act of ascent was part of the meaning. This design slows the body, and in slowing the body, it focuses attention. Dur Kurigalzu was not simply a ziggurat standing alone. It was part of a larger planned city, complete with palaces, temples, and administrative buildings laid out deliberately around it. The ziggurat functioned as the city's fixed center, spatially, symbolically, and structurally, everything oriented toward it. The city itself did not survive long compared to others in Mesopotamia, but the ziggurat endured because it was built differently. While surrounding buildings relied heavily on mud brick walls and lighter foundations, the ziggurat concentrated effort where it mattered most, at the base. This is a recurring pattern in advanced ancient construction. Spend effort where failure is irreversible. The stepped design also served a practical purpose. Each terrace sheds water outward, preventing rain from penetrating deep into the core. This passive drainage system reduces erosion and preserves internal stability without requiring maintenance or intervention. No channels to clog, no systems to repair, just gravity working as intended. The bricks themselves were stamped with inscriptions naming Kurigalzu, embedding authority directly into the material. But even these inscriptions feel secondary. The true statement of power here is not written. It is structural. The Kassite dynasty ruled over a land already saturated with history. To build something meaningful in that context required more than imitation. It required understanding what had already failed and improving upon it. Dur Kurigalzu reflects that understanding. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, this ziggurat stands as evidence that monumental architecture was not static tradition. It evolved through observation, adaptation, and accumulated knowledge. The builders were not repeating old forms blindly. They were correcting them. Standing near the ziggurat today, the experience is grounding rather than overwhelming. The structure does not dominate through height alone. It commands through mass and stillness. The earth around it feels quieter, as if shaped to support the presence above it. You become aware of scale differently, not vertical scale, but foundational scale. This is architecture that assumes time will pass, that erosion will occur, that cities will fall silent. And yet, it builds anyway, trusting that the core logic will outlast surface change. That trust was earned. The ziggurat of Dur Kurigalzu does not ask us to imagine lost technology or forgotten machines. It asks us to recognize something simpler and more demanding, that ancient builders understood materials deeply enough to predict how they would behave long after they were gone. Mud where mud was sufficient, stone where stone was necessary, design where neither alone would survive. That balance is rare. And it is why this structure still rises from the Mesopotamian plain, long after the city that surrounded it disappeared, long after the language of its builders fell silent. The ziggurat remains because it was not built for spectacle. It was built for endurance, a mountain shaped by human hands, a city anchored to the ground, an idea made heavy enough to resist time. That is the legacy of the ziggurat of Dur Kurigalzu, not as a relic of belief alone, but as a lesson in how ancient intelligence understood where strength truly belongs. Not at the summit, but at the base, Aksum Stele. On the high plateau of northern Ethiopia, where stone hills rise gently from red earth and the air feels thin and still, there stands a field of monoliths, so tall, so precisely shaped, that they seem less like objects placed on the land and more like ideas forced upward through it. These are the Aksum Stelae. At first glance they resemble obelisks, tall, narrow shafts of stone rising vertically into the sky. But a closer look reveals something far stranger. Their surfaces are carved to resemble multi-story buildings, complete with false doors, windows, and horizontal bands that imitate floors. Stone here is pretending to be architecture, and that choice is deliberate. The stelae were erected by the Kingdom of Aksum, one of the great ancient powers of Africa, flourishing from roughly the first millennium BCE into the early centuries CE. Aksum controlled trade routes linking Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean, minted its own coins, and interacted diplomatically with Rome and Persia. But the stelae do not celebrate trade or conquest. They mark something deeper. Each stele stands above an underground chamber, elaborate rock-cut tombs carved beneath the surface. The monoliths were not monuments meant to be entered or climbed. They were markers, signals rising above the ground to announce what lay below. This inversion matters. Meaning here is buried. Stone rises only to point downward. The largest of the stelae weigh hundreds of tons and were carved from single blocks of granite, quarried kilometers away. Transporting them required extraordinary coordination, control, and patience. Raising them upright demanded precise balance. One miscalculation would mean collapse. And in fact, several stelae did fall, leaving shattered giants frozen mid-failure. Those fallen stones are as important as the standing ones. They show that this was not myth or exaggeration. These monoliths were attempted at the absolute limit of what was physically possible with ancient tools and techniques. The builders were not guessing. They were pushing boundaries knowingly. The carved facades on the stelae are astonishing in their discipline. Windows align vertically. Doorways are centered. Decorative bands remain consistent across surfaces tens of meters high. This required pre-planning at full scale. Mental architecture translated directly into stone without the option of correction. Granite does not forgive mistakes. And yet, the execution is controlled. What is especially striking is that these towering monuments were erected without surrounding temples, without massive platforms, without enclosing walls. The stelae stand in open space, relying on proportion and placement rather than context to convey significance. They do not dominate through enclosure. They dominate through presence. The underground tombs beneath them were equally complex, consisting of chambers, corridors, and false doors carved into bedrock. These spaces were not utilitarian graves. They were symbolic dwellings for the dead, mirroring elite houses above ground. The stelae above completed that symbolism. House below, house above, stone connecting both. This vertical dialogue between surface and subsurface reveals a worldview where death was not separation, but relocation. The living and the dead occupied parallel architectures, linked by stone markers that fixed memory into the landscape. Engineering here served belief. But belief was grounded in physics. The bases of the stelae were carefully prepared, with sockets cut into bedrock to stabilize the monoliths and distribute their immense weight. Without these foundations, even the most perfectly carved stele would have toppled quickly. Again, what matters is not the visible stone. It is the preparation beneath it. The most famous stele, once removed and later returned, stands as proof of this foundation logic. When re-erected in modern times, engineers relied on principles the Axumites already understood: center of gravity, load distribution, and anchoring depth. The ancient solution still worked. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, the Axum stelae stand as one of the clearest examples that monumental ambition existed far beyond the region's history once prioritized. These builders did not lack knowledge. They applied it confidently, publicly, and at extraordinary scale. What history once struggled to accept was not the stone. It was the source. Standing among the stelae today, the feeling is not one of mystery in the sensational sense. It is one of discipline. These stones are not chaotic. They are ordered, intentional, and restrained. Even the tallest stele does not flare or widen dramatically. It narrows subtly as it rises, reducing wind stress and visual heaviness. The form is elegant because it had to be. Elegance here is structural. The fallen stelae, lying fractured across the field, remind us how narrow the margin was between success and failure. The Axumites were willing to risk collapse in pursuit of permanence. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they did not, and they left both outcomes behind. That honesty is rare. The Axum stelae do not tell us that ancient people possessed magical technology or forgotten machines. They tell us something far more demanding: that human intelligence, when organized and confident, has always been capable of extraordinary precision, even with limited tools. Stone shaped like buildings, buildings marking the dead anchoring memory. That is the logic carved into this field. The stelae remain not because they were indestructible, but because they were thought through, from quarry to carving to foundation to placement. They stand as vertical sentences written in granite, telling us that long before modern engineering, people already understood how to make ideas stand upright and resist time. Not through height alone, but through balance. And as the Ethiopian plateau holds these stones steady beneath changing skies, the message remains clear. History was never lacking intelligence. It was only selective in where it chose to look. Chenko. Just beyond the ancient capital of Cusco, where limestone hills rise softly above the valley and the sound of the city fades into wind and birdsong, there is a place where stone was not stacked, lifted, or assembled, but hollowed, guided, and persuaded into meaning. This is Chenko. At first glance, Chenko appears unfinished. There are no towering walls, no massive platforms, no monumental facades declaring power. Instead, the site feels fractured. A scatter of carved rock, exposed chambers, channels cut into living stone, and surfaces shaped so subtly that their intention is easy to miss. And yet, nothing here is accidental. Chenko is not architecture in the conventional sense. It is sculpted geology. The Inca builders did not bring stone to this site. They removed stone from it, carving directly into a massive limestone outcrop that already dominated the hillside. This choice matters, because carving into bedrock eliminates many risks associated with construction: collapse, shifting foundations, or joint failure. The stone could not move, so it was shaped. The name Chenko is often translated as zigzag, a reference to the winding channels carved into the rock's surface. These channels are precise, continuous, and intentional, guiding liquid, likely water, chicha, or sacrificial offerings, along a controlled path. Flow here was designed. Liquids were not poured randomly. They were directed, slowed, divided, and reunited, turning movement itself into ritual. The channels split and rejoin, creating uncertainty in outcome. Observers could not always predict where the liquid would emerge. This unpredictability was not a flaw. It was meaning. Beneath the carved surface lies a subterranean chamber, cut directly into the rock, with smooth walls, a carefully shaped ceiling, and niches that suggest ritual placement rather than storage. The chamber is cool, quiet, and acoustically distinct from the world above. Sound behaves differently here. A voice softens. Echo shortens. Attention turns inward. This chamber was not meant for crowds. It was meant for controlled presence, for moments when ritual required separation from daylight and public space. The transition from surface to subsurface is seamless. There are no constructed stairs, no added walls. You move directly from open sky into the earth itself, reinforcing the sense that Kenko was designed as a threshold between worlds rather than a destination. Above ground, carved forms suggest seats, altars, and platforms, though none are clearly labeled by function. This ambiguity is deliberate. The Inca did not inscribe explanations. Meaning was transmitted through use, memory, and participation. Knowledge here was embodied. The site's orientation is also significant. Chenko aligns with the surrounding landscape, hills, valleys, and sightlines toward Cusco, rather than toward abstract geometry. The Inca worldview did not separate architecture from nature. Stone and landscape were one system. The carved channels respond to slope and gravity with extraordinary sensitivity. Liquids move just fast enough to remain visible, just slow enough to remain controllable. This balance requires careful calibration, not guesswork. The builders understood fluid behavior. They also understood time. At certain moments of day and year, light interacts with the carved surfaces, casting shadows that emphasize channels, edges, and voids. These effects are subtle. They do not announce themselves. They reward patience. You have to wait. Chenko likely functioned as a ritual site tied to cycles, agricultural, ceremonial, and cosmological, rather than a single-purpose shrine. Its power lies not in spectacle, but in repetition, returning to the same carved stone, watching the same flows, entering the same chamber, season after season. Stone here held memory through use, not inscription. What makes Chenko especially important in a series about ancient structures that challenge modern expectations is how restrained it is. There is no attempt to overwhelm, no attempt to impress through mass or height. The sophistication is internal. Carving into bedrock requires absolute confidence. Mistakes cannot be hidden. Every cut remains visible. The smoothness of the chamber walls, the continuity of the channels, and the coherence of the overall layout show that this was not experimentation. It was mastery. The Inca are often remembered for their massive stone blocks and perfectly fitted walls. Chenko shows a different dimension of their intelligence, one focused on process rather than product, on interaction rather than display. Here, stone does not stand still. It participates. Liquid moves. Sound changes. Light shifts. The body responds. Chenko turns geology into ritual instrument. Standing at the site today, the experience is quiet but unsettling. There is a sense that the stone is waiting, not passively, but attentively, for actions that once gave it purpose. The channels still guide water. The chamber still alters sound. The rock still holds shape. Nothing has failed. In a series exploring ancient places that appear beyond modern expectations, Chenko reminds us that advanced knowledge does not always produce grand monuments. Sometimes it produces places that only reveal themselves slowly, to those willing to move carefully and observe closely. This was not a site built to be seen once. It was built to be returned to. Stone carved into flow, flow shaped into ritual, ritual anchored to land. That is the logic of Chenko. Not a temple standing apart from nature, but nature shaped just enough to become sacred. A reminder that the Inca did not conquer stone. They listened to it. And by doing so, they created a place where earth, water, light, and human intention met in quiet balance, leaving behind one of the most subtle and enduring ritual landscapes of the ancient world. Not towering, not loud, but precise, and still unmistakably intentional. Pyramid of the Magician. In the northern Yucatan Peninsula, where the land stretches flat and dry and rivers exist only underground, there is a pyramid that does not follow the visual language most people associate with Maya civilization. It does not rise from a square base. It does not repeat the stepped geometry seen at sites like Tikal or Chichen Itza, and it does not appear to impose itself aggressively on the surrounding landscape. This is the Pyramid of the Magician at Uxmal, and its difference begins at ground level. Unlike most Maya pyramids, the base of this structure is oval. This is not a stylistic flourish. It is an architectural decision that immediately changes how weight, stress, and movement behave throughout the structure. Corners concentrate pressure, curves distribute it. In a region where the ground is composed of porous limestone and seasonal rains saturate the soil unpredictably, this distinction matters. Uxmal exists in a landscape without surface water. There are no rivers to channel, no lakes to settle beside. Survival here depended on rain capture, underground cisterns known as chultans, and careful control of runoff across every built surface. Architecture in this region was not symbolic first. It was environmental first. The Pyramid of the Magician occupies the central high ground of the city, not simply as a ceremonial focal point, but as a stabilizing mass within a carefully engineered urban system. Its bulk anchors terraces, redirects water flow, and creates a reliable core around which the rest of Uxmal could function. What we see today is not a single construction event. Archaeology shows that the pyramid contains multiple building phases, each one enclosing an earlier structure rather than destroying it. New temples were built directly over old ones, preserving orientation, alignment, and position. This tells us something important about how the builders understood sacred space. The holiness of this place was not tied to a specific building. It was tied to the location itself. Each generation chose to add rather than replace, treating the pyramid as a living structure that accumulated meaning through continuity rather than reinvention. This required extraordinary planning, because building upward over existing structures means committing to their geometry permanently. Errors cannot be corrected later. The steepness of the pyramid is one of its most noticeable features. The sides rise sharply, creating an ascent that feels uncomfortable even for a modern visitor. This was intentional. Movement here was meant to be controlled. Ascending the pyramid was not an everyday action. It was a ritual progression that demanded attention, balance, and restraint. At the summit sits a temple richly decorated in the Puig architectural style, characterized by intricate stone mosaics, repeated masks, and tightly fitted geometric elements. These decorations are not superficial. They are part of the wall system itself, integrated into the structure rather than applied to it. Each stone is cut precisely to interlock with those around it, distributing load and resisting movement without the use of mortar. This kind of construction requires planning at full scale. Stones must be cut, knowing exactly where they will be placed. Mistakes cannot be hidden. In limestone, errors propagate quickly. The precision visible here reflects a mature architectural tradition, not experimentation. The oval form of the pyramid also influences how the structure interacts with light and shadow. As the sun moves across the sky, shadows slide smoothly along curved surfaces rather than breaking sharply at corners. This creates subtle visual effects that change throughout the day without dramatic contrasts. The building feels alive in time rather than frozen in form. Astronomical alignment is present here, but it is not theatrical. The pyramid is associated with Venus cycles, which were deeply important in Maya cosmology, but the alignment is embedded quietly into orientation rather than announced through extreme sightlines. This is knowledge meant to be lived with, not displayed. Uxmal as a whole reflects this philosophy. It is a city designed for coherence rather than dominance. Buildings face each other with intention. Courtyards are proportioned carefully. Movement through the city feels guided without being constrained. The Pyramid of the Magician acts as an anchor within this system, not as a separate monument demanding attention. What makes this pyramid especially significant in a broader historical context is that it demonstrates innovation without rupture. The builders did not abandon Maya traditions. They adapted them to local conditions, developing solutions that look unusual only when compared to regions with different environmental challenges. The lack of surface water forced architectural intelligence to express itself in stone mass, slope management, and runoff control, rather than canals or reservoirs. The pyramid's form reflects this reality directly. Standing before the structure today, the impression is not one of overwhelming size, but of composure. The pyramid feels settled. It does not dominate the skyline aggressively. It occupies space confidently, as if it has always belonged exactly where it stands. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, the Pyramid of the Magician does not do so through mystery or exaggeration. It does so through clarity. Every major feature has a reason. Every deviation from the norm solves a specific problem. This was not a monument built to impress outsiders. It was architecture built to function for generations. The accumulation of construction phases, the careful choice of form, the integration of decoration into structure, and the relationship between the pyramid and the surrounding city all point to a society that understood long-term planning in an environment where mistakes were costly. The Maya builders of Uxmal were not experimenting with stone. They were refining a system they trusted. And that trust is visible in the confidence of the structure itself. The Pyramid of the Magician remains standing not because it is mythical, but because it was designed with a deep understanding of land, material, and time. It does not ask us to imagine lost technologies or forgotten machines. It asks us to recognize disciplined intelligence applied patiently, layer by layer, over centuries. Stone placed where it mattered. Form chosen for stability. Sacred space maintained through continuity rather than spectacle. That is what this pyramid represents. Not a legend turned into architecture, but a civilization solving reality carefully, decisively, and successfully with stone. Alba Fucins. High in the Apennine Mountains of central Italy, far from the coast and far from the comfortable river valleys that usually give rise to cities, there is a stone settlement placed with such a deliberation that its existence feels less like expansion and more like control. This is Alba Fucins. Founded in the late 4th century BCE as a Roman Latin colony, Alba Fucins occupies a cold, elevated plateau more than 1,000 meters above sea level. Winters here are harsh, winds are constant, agriculture is difficult. And yet, the Romans chose this location intentionally, carving a permanent stone city into terrain that offered little comfort and no immediate abundance. That decision tells us everything. Alba Fucins was not founded to grow organically. It was founded to hold ground. The city's defining feature is its fortification system, built from massive polygonal limestone blocks fitted together with such precision that mortar was unnecessary. These walls are often called cyclopean, not because of myth, but because their scale feels excessive compared to the visible tools of the time. Each block was cut, shaped, transported uphill, and placed so that its irregular faces locked tightly against its neighbors. The joints are so exact that even today it is difficult to insert a blade between them. This kind of masonry is not decorative. It is structural discipline pushed to its limit. The walls follow the contours of the plateau precisely. They do not impose straight lines where the land resists them. Instead, they bend, adapt, and tighten where slopes steepen or access narrows. This shows a deep understanding of defensive topography rather than a reliance on height alone. Stone here is not standing apart from the landscape, it is responding to it. Within the walls, the city follows a rational plan. Streets are laid out deliberately. Public buildings occupy stable ground. The forum, basilica, temples, and later Christian church all sit on reinforced stone platforms that compensate for uneven bedrock and seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. This is not temporary occupation, it is environmental commitment. What makes Alba Fucins especially significant is that it was built in a region already inhabited long before Roman arrival. The polygonal stonework of the walls shows techniques that likely predate Rome itself, inherited from earlier Italic traditions and then refined under Roman organization. This is not innovation from nothing. It is assimilation of knowledge. The Romans did not replace local engineering traditions. They absorbed them, scaled them, and applied them systematically. Alba Fucins is evidence of that process in stone. The city's location allowed control of mountain routes linking northern and southern Italy. From here, movement could be observed, restricted, and taxed. Alba Fucins functioned less as a commercial hub and more as a stabilizing anchor within a contested landscape. Its architecture reflects that role. Buildings are robust rather than ornamental. Public spaces are clearly defined, but not extravagant. The emphasis is on durability, legibility, and control rather than display. Even religious structures follow this logic. Temples were built on high stone podia, isolating them from ground moisture and frost damage. Later, a Christian basilica reused the same foundations, trusting stone laid centuries earlier to support new belief systems without structural change. This reuse is crucial. It shows that the foundational logic of the city was sound enough to transcend political and religious transformation. Empires changed. Beliefs shifted. The stone remained relevant. Alba Fucens also reveals how Roman cities managed water in difficult terrain. Cisterns were carved into rock. Channels guided runoff away from streets. Slopes were stabilized to prevent erosion. There are no grand aqueducts here because the environment did not allow them. Instead, the city adapted quietly. What survives today is remarkably intact. Walls still define the city's perimeter. Streets remain readable. Foundations are stable. The city did not collapse into ruin through failure. It was gradually abandoned as political and economic priorities moved elsewhere. The stone did not fail. Standing within Alba Fucins today, the feeling is not grandeur, but clarity. You can see how movement was controlled. You can feel how the city resisted its environment rather than surrendering to it. The architecture communicates intention without explanation. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, Alba Fucins matters because it shows that advanced engineering does not always appear in fertile, forgiving landscapes. Sometimes it appears where survival is difficult and mistakes are costly. This city was not built because the land was easy. It was built because the land mattered. The builders understood that permanence in hostile terrain requires discipline at the foundation level. Walls had to hold, streets had to drain. Buildings had to endure cold, wind, and time. Nothing here is accidental. Alba Fucins stands as a reminder that Roman engineering excellence was not limited to monumental cities like Rome itself. It extended into remote, demanding environments where stone had to perform perfectly just to keep life stable. This was not architecture of luxury. It was architecture of control and endurance. And that is why it still stands. The city does not ask us to imagine lost technologies or mysterious builders. It shows us something more convincing. What happens when knowledge is applied consistently, when local technique is respected, and when stone is used not to impress, but to last? Alba Fucins remains on its plateau because it was never careless. Stone placed with restraint. Ground chosen with intent. A city built to hold position rather than attention. That is the quiet strength of Alba Fucins. Not a ruin, waiting to be explained away, but a lesson still visible in limestone. That history's most effective structures are often the ones that understood their environment so well that they had no reason to fail. Sanjay Gandhi National Park Caves. In the middle of one of the most crowded modern cities on Earth, where traffic noise rarely fades and concrete stretches uninterrupted to the horizon, there is a forested plateau that quietly preserves an entirely different relationship between humans, stone, and time. This is the cave complex inside Sanjay Gandhi National Park, best known through the ancient Kanheri caves. What makes this place unsettling is not its age alone, but its location. These caves were carved into volcanic basalt more than 2,000 years ago, and yet today they sit surrounded by Mumbai, a city that grew around them without ever fully absorbing them. The forest remained. The rock remained. The caves remained functional long after the world above changed completely. Unlike freestanding monuments, these caves were not built by stacking stone or transporting blocks. They were created by removal, by patiently cutting downward and inward into solid basalt, one of the hardest and most resistant building materials available in the subcontinent. This was not casual excavation. Basalt does not allow correction. Every cut is permanent. Every mistake remains visible. The cave complex consists of more than 100 excavated spaces, ranging from small monk cells to vast assembly halls, water cisterns, stairways, and rock-cut courtyards. These were not isolated shelters. Together, they form a carefully organized monastic settlement that functioned continuously for centuries. The placement of the caves follows a clear logic. They are carved along the slopes of a basalt hill, aligned to manage rainwater, airflow, and movement without artificial reinforcement. The builders understood the terrain before they began cutting. Water was the first concern. The monsoon defines this landscape. Heavy seasonal rain can overwhelm poorly planned structures within days. Instead of resisting it, the cave builders integrated it directly into the design. Channels, carved into the rock-guide rainwater toward cisterns cut deep into the basalt, allowing storage through dry months. These cisterns are not simple pits. They are carefully shaped chambers with smooth interiors that reduce contamination and evaporation. Many still collect water today, functioning exactly as they did centuries ago. This alone tells us something important. The caves were not temporary retreats. They were designed for long-term habitation. Large chaitya halls, used for communal gathering and ritual, were carved with precise proportions. Pillars were left in place not for decoration, but because removing them would compromise structural stability. The rock itself dictated where supports had to remain. Architecture here follows geology. Rather than forcing symmetry, the builders responded to stress lines, grain direction, and load paths within the basalt. Ceilings curve subtly to prevent cracking. Walls remain thick where pressure concentrates. Spaces feel balanced, because they are balanced. Sound behaves carefully in these halls. Voices carry without echo. Chanting fills the space evenly. This was not accidental. The dimensions were tuned through experience, likely refined over generations. Smaller cells line the complex, each one carved to provide just enough space for rest and contemplation. There is no excess, no ornament for display. Comfort comes from protection, not luxury. The absence of decoration is meaningful. These caves were not meant to impress outsiders. They were built to support discipline, routine, and permanence. The stone was shaped to remove distraction rather than create spectacle. What makes the Sanjay Gandhi caves especially important is how integrated they are with their environment. The builders did not clear the forest. They worked within it. Trees stabilized soil. Shade reduced temperature extremes. The caves remain cool even during intense heat. This is passive environmental engineering. Long before modern concepts of sustainability. These builders understood that working with nature required less effort than fighting it. Over centuries, different phases of carving expanded the complex. New caves were added without compromising existing ones. This required careful planning, because removing too much stone in the wrong place could destabilize everything around it. Yet the system holds. The rock-cut stairways remain aligned. Drainage still works. Structural failure is rare. This indicates shared knowledge passed down across generations of builders who understood the limits of the material intimately. In a broader historical sense, these caves challenge a persistent misconception that ancient Indian rock-cut architecture was primarily artistic or symbolic. In reality, it was highly technical, grounded in physics, material science, and environmental observation. The caves are evidence of architectural thinking that prioritized longevity over appearance. Standing inside these spaces today, the city feels distant. Sound softens. Temperature drops. The rock absorbs noise and distraction. The experience is deeply physical. You become aware of gravity, mass, and enclosure. This was intentional. The caves were designed to separate mental space from external chaos, not by walls or gates, but by depth and stone. That separation still works, even with millions of people living just beyond the forest edge. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, The Sanjay Gandhi caves matter because they show how advanced construction does not always result in visible monuments. Sometimes it results in spaces that disappear into the land so completely that they survive by being overlooked. No empire guarded these caves. No army protected them. They endured because they were carved correctly. They resisted weather because they respected water. They resisted collapse because they followed stone. They resisted erasure because they never depended on surface presence. The caves remain not as ruins waiting for explanation, but as functioning spaces that still perform their original role, sheltering silence, regulating climate, and holding time still inside rock. They do not tell a dramatic story. They tell a disciplined one. That long before modern cities learned how to manage water, heat, and density, people here already understood how to do it by listening carefully to the land they were carving into. Stone was not conquered. It was negotiated with. And because of that, these caves still exist, quietly embedded inside one of the busiest urban regions on Earth, continuing to do exactly what they were designed to do: hold space, hold silence, hold time. That is the real achievement of the Sanjay Gandhi cave complex. Not mystery, not myth, but intelligence applied patiently, cut by cut, into stone that still remembers every decision made against it. Udayagiri Caves. On a low sandstone hill near modern Bhubaneswar, where the land rises gently rather than dramatically, there is a cluster of rock-cut spaces that do not impress through size or mass, but through clarity of intention and precision of execution. These are the Udayagiri Caves. At first glance, the site appears simple. Shallow caves carved into a hillside, open facades, modest chambers. No towering cliffs, no deep subterranean passages, no monumental enclosure walls. And yet, the longer one studies Udayagiri, the clearer it becomes that nothing here is casual. This is not improvisation carved into stone. It is a carefully planned ritual landscape. The caves date primarily to the early 5th century CE during the Gupta period, a time often described as a classical age of Indian art and political stability. But what matters here is not the dynasty itself. What matters is how knowledge, belief, and material were brought into alignment. Udayagiri was not built by stacking stone or transporting blocks across distance. It was created by carving directly into living rock, using tools and techniques that demanded absolute confidence. Sandstone may be softer than basalt, but it fractures unpredictably. Poor planning can ruin an entire face of rock. Every cut at Udayagiri was final. The caves are arranged along the slope of the hill, positioned to face outward rather than inward. They engage the landscape rather than withdrawing from it. Light enters freely. Air circulates naturally. The builders were not trying to isolate ritual from the world. They were integrating it into place. Each cave follows a consistent logic. Entrances are framed cleanly. Interiors are proportioned for presence rather than crowding. Walls are left largely undecorated, allowing the carved reliefs that do exist to command full attention. Those reliefs are where Udayagiri speaks most clearly. The most famous carving depicts the Varaha avatar of Vishnu, lifting the earth, goddess from cosmic waters. This is not decoration placed on a finished wall. The relief is carved directly into the rock face itself, using the natural surface as part of the composition. Stone here is not background, it is participant. The scale of the Varaha relief is controlled rather than overwhelming. The figures emerge from the rock without breaking it apart. Edges are precise. Depth is measured. The carving respects the integrity of the stone while transforming it into narrative. This balance is critical. The builders understood exactly how far they could go without weakening the structure. They carved meaning into stone without compromising stability. That requires both artistic vision and structural awareness. The interiors of the caves show similar restraint. There are no unnecessary recesses, no excessive ornamentation. Ceilings remain thick where weight concentrates. Floors are leveled carefully. Niches are placed deliberately rather than symmetrically. Function guides form. These spaces were used for ritual, contemplation, and royal presence. not for long-term habitation. They were meant to be visited, occupied briefly, and left intact. Their design reflects that purpose clearly. Water management is subtle but present. The hill's slope allows rainwater to move naturally away from entrances. Surfaces are angled slightly to prevent pooling. No elaborate drainage channels were needed because the landscape itself was part of the solution. This is environmental intelligence expressed quietly. Udayagiri also reflects a moment of transition. Unlike earlier rock-cut sites focused on monastic withdrawal, these caves are closely tied to state power and royal ritual. Inscriptions identify rulers. Iconography emphasizes cosmic order and kingship. But even here, restraint dominates. The caves do not glorify rulers through scale. They legitimize authority through alignment with cosmic principles rather than architectural excess. The stone remains primary. Power is suggested, not imposed. What makes Udayagiri especially important in a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations is how complete its thinking is. Art, architecture, geology, and ritual are not separate systems here. They are one system. The builders did not treat the hill as raw material to be conquered. They treated it as a framework to be revealed. The caves follow the rock's natural contours. Reliefs emerge where the surface allows them to emerge. Space is created where stability permits it. Nothing is forced. Standing at Udayagiri today, the experience is calm and focused. The sight does not overwhelm the senses. It directs attention. You notice how light changes across carved surfaces. You notice how sound behaves inside the chambers. You notice how the hill feels shaped rather than damaged. That sensation is not accidental. It is the result of disciplined decision-making applied consistently across the site. The builders knew what they wanted these spaces to do, and they shaped stone only as much as necessary to achieve that. In contrast to monumental platforms or massive underground complexes, Udayagiri shows another form of ancient intelligence, one that values precision over scale, integration over dominance. These caves do not challenge history by suggesting lost technologies or forgotten machines. They challenge it by showing how much could be achieved through careful observation, restraint, and respect for material. Stone was not used to overwhelm belief. It was used to support it. The reliefs endure because they were carved where the rock could carry them. The chambers endure because they were hollowed where the hill allowed it. The site endures because its creators never tried to exceed the limits of what the stone could sustain. That is why Udayagiri still feels intact. Not untouched, not pristine, but balanced. In a world where ancient architecture is often judged by size or mystery, Udayagiri offers a quieter lesson. That permanence is not always achieved by building more, digging deeper, or lifting higher. Sometimes it is achieved by doing exactly enough. Stone shaped with restraint, meaning carved without excess. A hillside transformed into ritual without being destroyed. That is the real achievement of the Udayagiri caves. Not a spectacle frozen in time, but a place where intention, material, and belief met cleanly, and stayed aligned long after the people who carved it were gone. Bingling Grottos. Along a bend of the Yellow River in Gansu province, where water has cut deep into soft cliffs over tens of thousands of years, there is a stretch of rock face that looks, at first, like nothing more than eroded stone shaped by wind and current. It is only when you draw closer that the surface resolves into hundreds of openings, carvings, and figures emerging directly from the cliff itself. This is the Bingling Grottos. The site does not announce itself from afar. There are no massive walls or formal entrances. Access historically came from the river, not the land, and that alone explains much about how and why this place was created. Bingling exists at the intersection of geography, belief, and patience, carved gradually into cliffs that were already being shaped by nature, long before the first human tools touched them. Construction at Bingling began as early as the 4th century CE and continued, in phases, for more than 1,000 years. Multiple dynasties contributed to what exists today, not by replacing earlier work, but by extending it, refining it, and adapting it to changing religious, artistic, and political priorities. This is not a single project. It is accumulated intention. The cliffs are composed primarily of sandstone and conglomerate, materials that are workable but fragile. Carving into them requires restraint. Remove too much material and entire sections can collapse. Cut too deeply in the wrong place and fractures spread unpredictably. Every decision here carried risk. The builders responded by carving incrementally. Large Buddha figures were left partially attached to the cliff, their backs and sides integrated into the natural rock. Smaller niches were cut carefully around stable zones. Columns and ledges were left where needed, not for decoration, but to preserve load paths and reduce stress. Architecture here follows geology closely. Rather than flattening the cliff into a facade, the carvers allowed the rock to dictate form. Figures emerge where the cliff permits. Caves deepen where the stone holds. Empty space is avoided where collapse might follow. This creates a visual rhythm that feels organic, but it is anything but random. It is controlled adaptation. Many of the most impressive statues at Binkling appear monumental only because the cliff itself provides scale. The figures do not stand free. They are anchored, literally and structurally, to the mountain. Their size is balanced against the rock's ability to carry weight without failure. This is not symbolic attachment. It is engineering necessity. Inside the caves, the spaces are modest. Ceilings are kept thick. Walls remain curved rather than squared. Sharp corners are avoided. These choices reduce stress concentration and slow crack propagation in the stone. The result is stability over centuries, even as the river below continues to reshape the landscape. Water management is subtle but essential. Rainwater running. Down the cliff is diverted naturally by carved lips and surface angles. Openings are positioned to reduce direct exposure. No complex drainage systems were required because the site works with gravity instead of against it. The Yellow River is both threat and protection. It erodes the cliffs, but it also isolated the site for long periods, limiting disturbance. For much of its history, Bingling was reachable only by boat, which shaped how materials, workers, and visitors moved through the space. This limited access slowed construction, but it also preserved coherence. Each new phase of carving had to respect what already existed. There was no easy way to demolish or radically alter earlier work. The cliff demanded continuity. This continuity is visible in how iconography evolves without breaking structural logic. Early figures are simpler, more restrained. Later ones grow more elaborate, but they still conform to the same spatial constraints. Decoration increases where rock allows it, and recedes where stability would be compromised. Belief adapted to stone, not the other way around. The placement of figures follows both spiritual hierarchy and physical necessity. Larger Buddhas occupy central, stable faces. Smaller attendants, bodhisattvas, and narrative scenes fill peripheral zones. This creates visual order while maintaining structural balance. Sound inside the caves is muted and directional. Voices do not echo dramatically. The rock absorbs noise. This produces an environment suited to quiet ritual rather than public spectacle. These were spaces meant for focused presence, not crowds. The caves were painted originally, though much of that pigment has faded. Even so, the carving itself carries meaning without color. Facial expressions are calm. Gestures are controlled. Bodies are proportioned to the rock rather than idealized form. This restraint is intentional. Bingling was not built to compete with imperial architecture or urban temples. It exists apart from cities, apart from administration, and largely apart from daily life. Its power comes from persistence rather than dominance. What makes the Bingling grottos especially important in a series about ancient structures that challenge modern expectations is how clearly they demonstrate long-term planning without central control. Different dynasties, different artists, different beliefs contributed to the same cliff, yet the site never collapses into chaos. That coherence comes from respect for constraints. The builders did not share blueprints across centuries. What they shared was understanding of material limits. That understanding governed every decision more strongly than style or doctrine. Standing at Bingling today, the experience is slow and quiet. The river moves below. The cliff rises above. The carvings feel inseparable from the rock that holds them. Nothing feels forced. Nothing feels rushed. Time is the dominant presence here. Not frozen time, but accumulated time. In a modern context, where construction often ignores long-term material behavior, Bingling offers a different model. It shows what happens when builders assume that future generations will continue their work, and therefore refuse to make choices that would prevent that continuation. Carving less instead of more, leaving stone where it matters, allowing form to follow structure. These decisions allowed the grottos to survive earthquakes, erosion, political collapse, and abandonment. They survived not because they were hidden, but because they were carved correctly. The Bingling grottos do not ask us to imagine lost technologies or forgotten tools. They ask us to recognize something more demanding. Discipline applied patiently over centuries, guided by respect for material and place. Stone was not mastered here, it was listened to. And because of that, the cliff still speaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, about what ancient builders were capable of, when they understood that permanence is achieved not by conquering nature, but by aligning with it, one careful cut at a time. Arch of Trajan, Timgad. At the western edge of the Roman city of Timgad, where the straight lines of the grid finally loosen and the desert begins to reclaim space, there stands an arch that seems, at first, to be a symbol rather than a structure, a ceremonial threshold marking the boundary between city and open land. This is the Arch of Trajan. Most visitors notice its proportions, its surviving columns, its decorative intent. What is rarely considered is what lies beneath it, the foundation logic that allowed an isolated stone arch to stand, unreinforced, for nearly 2,000 years in a region of temperature extremes, shifting soils, and long abandonment. An arch is not a wall. It does not spread weight evenly. It concentrates force. Every stone in an arch presses outward as well as downward. Without proper foundations, that force slowly tears the structure apart. In cities built on stable bedrock, this risk is reduced. Timgad was not built on bedrock. It was built on prepared ground. The arch stands at the end of the Decumanus Maximus, aligned precisely with the city's grid. This alignment is not only symbolic. It ensures that the structure sits atop the same engineered sublayers that support Timgad's streets: compacted stone, rubble fill, and leveled bedding designed to distribute load and manage water runoff. The foundations beneath the arch extend wider than the visible base, spreading weight laterally into the surrounding ground. This prevents differential settling, a common cause of arch collapse when one side sinks faster than the other. This is quiet engineering. The visible stones of the arch are limestone blocks cut to exact tolerances. But those stones only perform correctly because the ground beneath them was disciplined first. Roman builders understood that an arch does not forgive movement. Even minor shifts accumulate stress rapidly. So they removed uncertainty at the foundation level. Excavation and structural analysis show that the base of the arch was set into a prepared trench filled with layered stone and compacted material, creating a stable platform that resists both compression and lateral spread. This method mirrors the foundation logic used throughout Timgad, scaled appropriately for a freestanding structure. The arch was never meant to lean on adjacent buildings. It was meant to stand alone. That independence required confidence in ground preparation. When the city around it fell into ruin, when streets filled with sand and walls collapsed, the arch remained upright because it was never dependent on the life of the city to remain stable. It depended only on its foundations. The choice of location also matters. The arch sits where drainage is naturally favorable. Slight elevation changes guide water away from the base rather than toward it. This reduces erosion beneath the structure during rare but destructive desert rains. Once again, the Romans worked with terrain rather than forcing it. The arch's form amplifies this logic. Its proportions are conservative. The span is wide enough to function ceremonially, but not so wide that lateral thrust overwhelms the stone. Decorative elements are restrained, avoiding unnecessary mass above the springing points where stress concentrates. Aesthetic decisions here are structural decisions. Even the surviving fluted columns and entablature reflect this restraint. Weight is kept low. The center of gravity remains controlled. Nothing about the design pushes the material to its limit. This is not ambition testing physics. It is physics respected. What makes the Arch of Trajan at Timgad especially important in a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations is that it represents Roman engineering at its most disciplined, not its most theatrical. There is no massive concrete core hidden behind stone cladding. There are no metal reinforcements. There is only stone, geometry, and prepared ground. The arch functioned as both marker and filter. It framed entry into the city, controlling movement symbolically while allowing practical passage. But unlike gates with doors or walls with towers, it relied entirely on presence rather than force. Its authority came from standing. Over centuries of abandonment, the surrounding city disappeared under sand. Streets vanished. Buildings collapsed. Vegetation returned. The arch remained visible because it did not depend on maintenance, repair, or continued occupation. It was built to be left alone. Standing near the arch today, the sense is not of ruin, but of pause. The structure still expects traffic. It still aligns with streets that no longer exist. Its foundations still perform the task they were given, even though the context that required them is gone. That endurance is not accidental. It reflects a Roman understanding that symbolic architecture only works if it is physically reliable. An arch that collapses loses meaning instantly. An arch that stands alone in silence gains it. In modern construction, arches are often reinforced, over-designed, or embedded within larger systems. At Timgad, the arch was given just enough support to endure indefinitely. No more, no less. This economy of effort is telling. The builders trusted their calculations. They trusted their material. They trusted the ground they prepared. The Arch of Trajan does not ask us to imagine lost technologies or mysterious methods. It demonstrates something far more instructive. That ancient builders achieved durability not by excess, but by precision. Stone cut to shape. Force directed intentionally. Ground prepared to carry responsibility. That is why this arch still stands at the edge of a vanished city, holding its shape against wind, heat, and time. It is not a fragment of grandeur. It is a lesson in foundations. A reminder that the most visible symbols of civilization often survive only because of the least visible. Work done beneath them. Work that was never meant to be admired, but without which nothing above could remain. The Arch of Trajan at Timgad stands today not as a ruin waiting for explanation, but as proof that when architecture begins with the ground, it can outlast the society that imagined it. And in that quiet endurance, it tells us exactly how much ancient engineers truly understood.